I like the question that Mary left off with, or used in her children's message. Are excuses ever good? And they're really not, except and unless they get me out of a problem. Then I don't mind using them. So, I guess I missed your message, right? So, Canaanization. Canaanization. That is a term that we used last week to kind of begin our series. And simply put, Canaanization is just defined as the lure. It is the enticement of any present culture that a person might find themselves in. And what's really detrimental, what's really scary about Canaanization is that it's everywhere all the time, whatever generation you live in, but especially in the modern world, because we can disseminate information so broadly, so widely. I've had this weird experience in the last month that I've noticed. Maybe it hasn't even been that long, but I've really only kind of caught this in the last probably couple of weeks. There's a couple of sites that I use. One of them is called Bible Gateway. And Bible Gateway is just really good for just pulling up some scripture that you want to read, or you can do these Hebrew and Greek word studies and things like that on it and stuff, and it'll break down passages. I really like it. And I've used it quite a bit, and I've noticed probably in the last few weeks that the sidebars that are there, there'll be sidebars like, if you're interested in going to a Christian college, call this number here, and Charles Stanley has a new book out, and David Jeremiah has this, that kind of stuff. And that's kind of cool. But as I'm looking at this, I look over at this, and on a sidebar here is an advertisement for bikini.com. I know it sounds funny, but these are scantily clad women. Last night, I went to Fox News. I went online to Fox News. Yes, I get my news from Fox News. I'm sorry. But I went online, I'm reading it, and they actually had an article by David Jeremiah as a part of their Fox News. And I'm starting to read it, and I'm reading, and I'm literally like this. My head is going back and forth 3 or 4 times until it finally dawned on me, it's the same bikini ad that's there. How do they, surrounded by all other good, wholesome stuff, how does that work like that? It's just really an issue of Canaanization. It's just the kind of influence, the lure that we have in any world at any given time. It just seems like it's a lot worse today. Well, this just kind of helps us to understand the vicious cycle that Israel has endured. As we're looking at the book of Judges and we're looking at the person of Gideon, they've endured it throughout their life, of course, but we're looking at it in terms of probably the last 180 years of living in the land of Canaan now. And their current despair, which they're under, comes from one of the many tribes that they neglected to drive out all the way back during the days of Joshua. In this case, it is the Midianites. And so the prevailing culture in the land of Canaan, we find, is really a mixture of various foreign gods and idols and practices, which became a terrible and deadly snare for the nation of Israel. Now, the purpose that Moses had, or that God had given to Moses and eventually to Joshua, the whole purpose for the land being cleansed was for the nation to give them time to kind of organize and to consolidate as a nation. Meant to help them to grow spiritually and mature into God's holy people. Because we can't forget, 400 years of bondage. That's what they were in. I made mention of this last week about the concentration camps in Germany prior to and during World War II. As horrible and as terrible as that was, the nation of Israel experienced these similar kinds of concentration camps for 400 years. That would mean that at least 3 generations were born into this concentration camp mentality, lived through it, and died in it as well. So it had taken a toll on them. And they needed to be rebuilt in every way, and especially spiritually. To become fully God's light to a dark world, they needed room to grow and with as little obstruction as possible. But they failed in this task. As time went on, the Canaanization grew and it became more powerful in their lives. And they were reminded of this. It's a passage of Scripture I'm going to put up on the screen here, and I'm just going to kind of refer to it here. Something we saw last week in chapter 6, verses 7 through 10, in very harsh words. A message delivered by an unnamed prophet, that they fell to the lure of the gods of the land because, in the last part of verse 10, it says they simply wouldn't obey God, which is just another way of saying they wouldn't listen to Him. And so God uses Israel's enemies to exact his discipline. And the Midianites here, in this particular case, are especially harsh, having driven Israel into caves and holes. But what happens now is we're going to pick the story up in verse 11 through 24. It kind of catches us by surprise as God is going to begin to deliver his nation here. Now, the writer of the book of Judges here, we don't really know who it is. The Talmud, which is kind of like a commentary, a later commentary on the Old Testament, claims that it's Samuel. I think that's a possibility. At least you can kind of picture that Samuel could have written large parts of it, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes here, because the writer is using this prophetic scolding here. And this prophetic scolding is kind of setting the stage for the call of Gideon. Now, for God to raise up a deliverer for his people, as he's been doing here, and he'll do a whole lot more of it after the time of Gideon, is really entirely an act of grace on his part. And if you remember, we said that Gideon's just one of 13 judges in this ugly cycle in the book of Judges. This cycle includes where the nation sins. And so God brings in his divine discipline, and they go some usually long captivity, 30, 40 years. And then eventually it gets so harsh, they cry out to God, and they repent. And then God will send in a rescuer. And then the rescuer does what he does, and he rescues them, and they have this period of peace for a while. And then it all starts over again. And it's a sickening cycle to read about. And unfortunately, we find the same kind of cycle too many times unfolds in our own lives as well. But on this particular occasion, they are hurting again. They cry out to God, but this time there's no picture, no description of their national repentance, no recognition of their shame or failure on their part. It's kind of like they're just hurting really bad, and they cry out to God and say, God, just get us out of this. So what does God do? Well, that's verses 7 through 10. God scolds them, basically tells them, I did all these things for you, but you just won't listen to me. And ironically, this is the only prophet that God sends to them throughout the book of Judges who will address them in this way. Well, here's now where Gideon enters the story. We pick it up in verse 11. Let's just read down through verse 16. It says, the angel of the Lord then came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite. Can you get that, Abiezrite? Why can't these people just come from Milwaukee or something? It's a whole lot easier to say. Anyways, his son Gideon is beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. Now, those two facts are really important here. We'll get back to that. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, the Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. Then Gideon said to him, well, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then, there's two words I'm sure we've used a lot in our Christian lives, right? God comes to me and we know he wants something done. Well, wait a minute then. Why then is, and then you kind of fill in the blanks. Well, this is Gideon. Why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. And the Lord looked at him and said, go in this your strength and deliver Israel. It's kind of like his way of saying, look, if that's how you feel, fine. Then we're going to take that and we're going to deliver you. We'll deliver you from the hand of Midian. And I am sending you. Have I not sent you? That's just his way of saying, am I not sending you to do this? So he says to him, well, O Lord, look at the excuses. How shall I deliver Israel? Behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. But the Lord said to him, surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat Midian as one man. So this right here is where Gideon's call to be counterculture, to break from the Canaanization of his own people, often sounds a little bit like us at times. Even when God makes it real clear at times that something big is happening. And he wants to use you to do it. And I'm meant to be a part. And even though that part seems to be real clear to me, yet apprehension can kind of set in. Now, Gideon is a guy who seemingly needs a lot of assurance. No, in fact, check that first. Let me use the word reassurance. He seems to be a guy that needs a lot of reassurance, even when God is the recruiter of some task that he wants him to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 parts to his call. 4 parts. And from this, we're going to try and measure the difference between our caution and our courage, because we need both. And somehow we've got to measure and balance the two against one another. Caution is not a bad thing. If I absolutely need, if I'm desperate to cross a busy highway, it would be foolish of me not to have caution, to stop and look down and go, wow, man, here's a big bulk of car. I've noticed that about every 30 seconds, it kind of breaks. I think maybe that's when I'll go. So when the break comes, you don't go because you're still too cautious. So caution is not a bad thing until it gets in the way of courage. Well, let's see what happens with Gideon here. Let's look at the first one, the first part to his call, and that is the announcement. And that'll be followed by his angst, and then Gideon is going to go through some kind of an analysis of this call, and then he'll make an appeal. So let's look first at the announcement. The angel of the Lord makes a divine appearance to Gideon. That's a big deal here. Gideon is in a wine press. That's where we find him. He's beating out wheat. Now, the very fact, and I don't know if you'll remember this from last week, so I'll try and fill some of this in, but the very fact that they even have wheat in order to beat out and to prepare is really a miracle here. It's really quite a blessing, because this was not how wheat was typically beaten out here. So for them to have it and for him to be able to beat it out somewhere is a good thing, but you don't do it in a wine press. And it's very likely that this wine press is kind of close to the opening of a cave or something, because they need to be able to run away when they can. Remember, we said that what they're experiencing here are all the residual effects of being under the thumb, under the oppression of the nation of Midian here. So this is the effects of them having to live in caves and things like that. It has to be some kind of a sheltered area here. Because what you don't want to do typically is when you beat out the wheat, you throw up the chaff in the air and the wind kind of blows it away and it kind of leaves a smoky effect. Well, you can't do that now, because that'll be like a smoke signal for the enemy to see. And this just reflected the uncertain, ugly, and oppressive times they were in. So he's here, and he's really preoccupied with all of this. Of course you would be. And then all of a sudden, this messenger of God comes to him. And I want us to kind of be able to really internalize what's happening in this whole setting, because it's kind of easy to read past all of this. And I want to put this up on the screen. This is not the second part to it. I just add something to that first part here. 2 words, uncertainty and preoccupation. Uncertainty and preoccupation are often the starting points that God will use in us to do something significant in our lives. This isn't how, as I said, what Gideon's doing here is not how you would best thresh wheat, but they don't have any choice. The circumstances around them force them to alter completely how a task is normally done most efficiently. Most efficiently, you go out to the wheat, you prepare it out there, you break it down, you throw the chaff up. That's the easiest thing to do. Now they got to lug all the stuff all the way back, probably to the cave entrance, to do it there, because they're under severe oppression. So now this seemingly easy task has become so much harder. It requires even more of my energy and attention and my preoccupation to get it done. And yet this is often where God shows up in our lives. And many times when he does, we have excuses, right? You know, Lord, this isn't probably the best time for all this. Maybe, God, it would be better if it kind of came when I was a little bit more alert, a little bit more prepared. And to kind of add to the already troubling setting here, the angel kind of gives this almost insensitive, superficial greeting in the last part of verse 12 there. Well, he says, hey, you're a mighty warrior. God is with you. And you can kind of almost picture Gideon here, can't you? And this brings us to now our second part of the story here, and that is his angst. There he is, preparing, beating on the wheat. He's in all the wrong places to do this. Can't you kind of picture Gideon going, wait, I'm sorry, what did you say? Are you talking to me? But Gideon kind of picks up on all of this in verse 13. God is with us, huh? That's what you're telling me? Then what am I doing here in a wine press when I should be in the field beating the wheat? Why is it that our enemies have us on the run in every direction? And you got to know this is probably something he's been thinking about for some time. He's frustrated. And his attempt here is to kind of try to turn the tables on God here. And he even uses God's own intervention for Israel to support his own frustration now. Yeah, okay, God, well, what about all those great things we've been told that you did in bringing us up out of the land of Egypt? Look at us now. You know, kind of all that stuff that the prophet just told us a little bit earlier. Yeah, what about all that? Why are we stuck in caves and holes? Why am I beating wheat out here in a wine press? Now, I don't think this is a knee-jerk response on his part. He legitimately feels abandoned. In his mind, frustration is serious and subtle. You ever feel that way? Just so frustrated? Feel abandoned at certain times in your life? God seems to have some really important concern that he wants you to get involved in just when you are the most uncertain about your life and you're preoccupied and just figuring out how to get through the day, how to get through the week, and you let him know about it. Now, I have to tell you, when I read this, I do not read this. Now, you could disagree with me on this. I'm not exactly sure where my theology comes down on this. But I don't read this as necessarily being sinful on Gideon's part. I don't necessarily read this as being unspiritual or unrighteous here for him. But it is very, very human. And we're allowed that. In fact, in verse 14, Israel kind of seems to let that go. And he just kind of continues to direct Gideon to his new assignment. And then comes the third part to his call here. That is his analysis, which always seems to follow. When I'm anxious and nervous about something new being added to my plate, I need to have the details. Tell me exactly what I'm doing here. Where am I going? I do that with my wife a lot of times, especially when I'm just frustrated. I got a lot. She wants me to do something. Okay, where exactly am I going? What exactly am I picking up? How much exactly is it going to cost? And that's when I'm frustrated, I need an over-analysis here. Actually, not a bad way to work through things. I'm at a place of uncertainty and preoccupation with that uncertainty, and God seems to be disengaged from it all. I'm frustrated. I feel abandoned by him from what's happening around me. The best way for God to get us re-energized is to assure us he really has been there all along, and then to reassert us into some new opportunity to show it. Does that sound complicated? When I'm most frustrated and I feel abandoned, what I need is for God to come to me to reassure me, hey, I've been there, and then for him to say, hey, I still have things for you to do. So I'm going to reassert you into a whole great plan for you. Now, Gideon here is very polite, but he's calculating. He tells him, look, I can't do this on my own. Just take a look at my family. My family's the least of all the clans, and I'm the youngest in my family here. Well, we've heard this before, right? I mean, this didn't work for Moses. It didn't work for David. Not that David complained about it, but I mean, it was the idea that, hey, he's the youngest out in the field. You can't use someone like him. He's just a squirt. And God says, no, I got something else here. So it doesn't work for those guys. And the reason why it doesn't work for those kind of things is because God is always the X factor. The X factor in things that overwhelm me is not me. It's not my liabilities. It's not my abilities. It's not the things I don't have, or it's not the things that I have. Those things are not the X factor. The X factor is always God, because he is limitless in what he can do and what he can do through me. So he tells verse 16, hey, Gideon, don't worry. You won't do this alone. I will be with you. And he's got all kinds of examples. I mean, you got Moses, you got David, you got Samuel. All of these would be examples that he would know very well. So he tells him, look, you won't do this alone, Gideon, and even better, we will win. We will win. So with this assurance from God, we know how the story goes, right? He is ready to get out there and get started, just like we would be. Okay, God, where do I go? How far? What's it going to cost? I don't care. Just send me out there. I'll take care of it. Not quite. He still has a few things to clear up here because, this is his analysis. But now he goes to the fourth part of his call here, and that is his appeal. His appeal. he requests here what I'm calling kind of a sort of sophisticated test. Now, Gideon doesn't call it a test, but that's really what it is. Let's pick it up in verse 17 down to verse 22. Look what he does here. So Gideon says to him, "If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign." That's kind of like the test there. "Show me a sign that it is you who speaks with me. Please do not depart from here until I come back to you and bring out my offering and lay it before you." Now I want you to understand, and we'll look at this in a second, what he's about to do here is going to take a lengthy part of time here for him to pull this whole thing off. So the angel says, "I'll remain until you return." So then Gideon went in and he prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. He put the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot. And he brought them out to him under the oak and presented to them. Now, verse 19 doesn't bring that out, but there's a good length of time that has expired here in trying to get all this stuff done. So the angel of God says to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay it on this rock and pour out the broth." And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand. He touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. Then the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. When Gideon saw that he was the angel of the Lord, he said, "Alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." And he says that in a very fearful tone, which again, we'll look at in a second. So what's happening here is, first and foremost, Gideon simply doesn't recognize the voice of God. That's kind of what verse 17 is telling us here. At least figuratively speaking, he doesn't recognize it. Why? Because he just doesn't quite have the spiritual ears yet that's needed. He's too reluctant. He's too cautious where courage is needed. And you kind of almost begin to wonder, in this early stage of Gideon's life, you kind of begin to wonder, what does God see in this guy? What is it about him that he wants to use him? Why him? Because this isn't Gideon's only attempt at clarifying something else that God wants him to do. A little bit later on, he's going to get even more sophisticated when we talk about the fleeces that he lays out. Now again, if you don't know that, we'll get to that, but that's even more sophisticated. But as I read this account more and more, I begin to think to myself that this is kind of precisely because of his reluctance that God chooses him. That it might be because this guy isn't quite, the bold warrior that many others were. That's why God chooses him. Because it's so much like us at times. Here's what Gideon does to make sure that he and God are on the right page. You got to love this here. In verse 18, first he tells the angel, "Wait right here." The angel says, "Sure, I'll wait here." He runs off. "I got a test for you." Now again, he doesn't use the word test. He thinks he's just putting together some kind of a sacrifice. So he runs off and he gets this offering, which is actually quite a sizable offering, to prepare a young goat and an ephah of flour. You realize an ephah of flour is 6 gallons of flour. There's no reason why you prepare that much for visitors that you would be feeding here. That'll take care of a whole group of people. And not to mention the fact it would take an extended period of time to prepare. So he just kind of comes up with this on his own. And the divine visitor, he waits. Now again, this is kind of tongue-in-cheek here, but you can kind of imagine after about, I don't know how long this takes. I actually went online because I wanted to find out what the more exacting Hebrew was intending to convey here. How much time went by? The only thing I could find from a couple of them is that they said it was an extended period of time. No one would give hours or minutes or anything like that. It's an extended period of time. So at some point, you can kind of imagine the angel sitting there going, "Where is this guy? I got people to bless and cities to destroy. I got to get going here." So he's sitting there for a long time. But finally he comes back. And the divine visitor accepts the offering through a miraculous display. You've got fire coming up from a rock. And then he disappears. Now notice also there's no detail given here by the writer as to the significance of all of this. But it all seems good. This all seems worthy of praise here. But Gideon takes it in the wrong way. He's reading into this whole event with kind of self-preserving motives here in verse 22, where he says, "Hey, look, I've seen God. I've seen him face to face," which they knew meant death, according all the way back to Exodus, Moses going up the mountain, coming down with the veil over his face and all that kind of stuff. Why does he do this? No courage. Very cautious guy, but no courage. He struggles terribly at almost every turn to just really trust God. Even here at a place of casual contact in conversation. It makes no difference at all. It's been an angel of the Lord that he's speaking to. He hasn't been talking to God face to face. So he's kind of got his theology misimplied. And he has to be consoled once again because he doesn't interpret this as a sign of intimacy, but instead of fear. And he worries for his life. So God reassures him again, don't worry, you're not going to die. And when he is, finally, perfectly satisfied with it all, he builds an altar. Now you talk about a guy who just seems so unlikely to take on such a courageous, trust-laden assignment. Gideon is not him. Most of the time when God calls us to some kind of tough position, tough ministry in life, he will not dot all of our I's or cross all of our T's. Rarely. Rarely. Usually that's the kind of thing that happens when I step out in faith. And when I step out in faith is when God begins to say, okay, I want you to go here. Take 3 steps that way, 4 steps this way, back up here, go forward there. Now that's not to say that God never leads us into darkness. I think he does, lots of times. Or sometimes we're just on a path in life that is taking us into darkness, and God says, I'm going to just let them go in. Because when I'm in the darkness, that's when I have to listen the most, right? When I'm in the darkness, that's when I have to obey the most. That's when God says to me, okay, Brian, take 4 steps forward. Don't take 5. Just take 4 steps, then stop. And when you stop, I want you to turn right. Don't turn left, turn right. Then when you turn right, take 10 steps. Don't take 11, take 10. Because what I don't know is if I take 4 steps forward, I'm fine. If I take 5, there's a cliff there. But I can't see the cliff. And then if I turn right and I take 10 steps, there's a bridge to get me over. But if I take 11 steps, I'm going to miss the bridge. And I don't know that, though. And I just have to obey. I have to listen to his voice here. So I think God does lead us or allows us into the darkness. But he doesn't leave us in blindness. Does that make sense? I tried to read through that a couple of times as I wrote that down. We can be led into the darkness, but we're not necessarily blind if we listen to the voice of God. God has manifested himself here in so many ways. He does it to us. It's meant to generate a heart of trust in him. The problem is Gideon doesn't seem to have this. Ever. Ever. But his continual reluctance, I look at my life, sometimes it's too much like me. But I'm glad that God still uses me when I'm like this. And that's one obvious fact here with Gideon. God still uses him, even though he's reluctant. But what it does do, the downfall to this is that it leaves me weak, timid, way too susceptible to failure later on in some other parts of my life, which is what happens to him later in life. But for right now, he's still rising in his promise. God gives him his first assignment, beginning in verse 25, and it's a proving ground for him because it's going to invoke an attack on a pagan temple that is operated and owned by his own father in his own family. We pick it up in verse 25, read down through verse 27. Now on that same night, it came about that the Lord said to him. Now, we've got to kind of understand the flow of the story here. What's happening here is God gives him the command at night, but it seems clear from the text that God wanted him to do what he's about to tell him to do in the daylight. And there's a reason why. So he tells him, take your father's bull and a second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal, which belongs to your father, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it. And build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this stronghold in an orderly manner. So this is a lot of instruction here. He's really getting the details here. Then take a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah, which you shall cut down. Then Gideon took 10 men of his servants, and he did as the Lord had spoken to him. That is awesome. Good. He's following through on this. But it came about because he was too afraid. There's the caution again. He's still going to carry out the plan, but there's always caution with him. Because he was too afraid of his father's household and the men of the city to do it by day, he does it by night. So you get a clear picture that God wanted him to do something and do this during the day, probably for everyone to see him. This is almost, this whole story is kind of like a sidebar to this greater story, because we still haven't gotten to the point of him going out and taking on the Midianites, right? So this is the whole side story here. He's given a divine, covert, black ops operation to go into his own family's pagan shrine, tear it down, build another altar to God right in its place, and then offer a proper sacrifice to God, all for the purpose of everybody in that community seeing it all. So he gets together 10 guys, and I'm sure he probably knows who he's picking out. He's got his sacred SEAL team together, and it's a go. And this is all a part of God reasserting his place in the land there, starting with Gideon's own family. And look what happens. Now, he's just had a divine encounter earlier. He's been told by the angel of God that he's a mighty warrior. God is with you, and don't worry, we're going to beat these guys. And then on top of that, he has a confirming sacrifice to boot. So when God personally gives him his first assignment on the very same day, his apprehension kicks in to high gear. He's afraid of his family. Now, this does certainly speak of how deeply Canaanized that the nation has become. And I don't doubt his fear for a second as being real here. It's a really serious offense, especially in Jewish culture, to rise up and to oppose your father and your family here. And I do applaud, you give credit where credit is due. I do applaud he does go through with it. But he always seems to be second-guessing God's motives. So he changes the tactics here, not because this is better for God, but because it's better for him. And the sidebar of this event, it is trivial as related to the original plan that God has of destroying the Midianites. But what this is doing, it's all about developing Gideon into someone whose reluctance doesn't always get in the way of his responsibilities. It's developing Gideon into a person whose caution is not always somehow dampening his courage here. But sadly, it never works for him. At least it doesn't work fully for him. He gets the job done in each of the cases that he's given, but he leaves too much spiritual debris along the way. And I'm going to kind of give away the climax here because I'm going to need to come back to this several times later. But Gideon is often looked at as like a significant role model for the Christian life. When I read his story, I come to the conclusion that he's not. You do not want to emulate too much from his life. Now, he's not terrible, of course, but there are so many other people in the Scriptures that are a whole lot better. Even David. For all of David's flaws in life, the one thing David had going for him is he knew how to repent. Gideon's a guy here who just doesn't know how to come to terms with the perfect will of God here. Let's pick it up, verse 28, down through verse 32. We'll finish with this passage here. It says, therefore on the day, where am I at? Verse 28. When the men of the city rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was torn down, and the Asherah, which was beside it, was cut down. And the second bull was offered on the altar which had been built. So they said to one another, well, who did this thing? And when they searched about and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, did this thing. Then the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son, that he may die. Wow, that's pretty serious. For as he has torn down the altar of Baal, and indeed he has cut down the Asherah which was beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you deliver him? Whoever will plead for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because someone has torn down this altar. Therefore on that day, Gideon here is renamed Jerub-Baal, which means let Baal contend against him because he had torn down his altar. So the fact of the matter is, Gideon has absolutely assessed his people and his culture correctly. They really are engrossed and captivated by the secular culture that is around them. His fear of them was certainly legitimate, but confronting it in the open would have been so much better than this clandestine nighttime operation. And what does the village do? The village responds, and they go out and get their own special commission here to investigate this, and they discover that it was Gideon. This is the same guy who is the son of the guy who maintains the altar here. And so they give him the worst of penalties, the death penalty. This is serious stuff because this is a direct assault on their way of life. And however corrupt it may be, strangely, Joash himself defends his own son. Now, I'm sure he does it because, Gideon is his son. But I'm sure he also does it, as he kind of brings out here, on the basis of the integrity of their own belief system. And I think verse 31, this is a great response on his part. You have to think that Joash has been thinking about this for a while. Are you now Baal's bodyguard? You guys are all upset to defend to God. Why does he need any defense here? Let him defend himself. You have to wonder how much, leftover memory of the worship of Yahweh is on his mind here. It's like, hey, the God of Israel has never had a problem defending himself. He wipes out kings, wipes out nations. He seas, brings plagues, he destroys fortresses. It wasn't that far earlier. It's less than a couple hundred years that Jericho was destroyed. That's still recent memory for them. The naming that he gives here, Jerubbaal. He does this on purpose. And again, this is another one of these words that I kind of checked out a little bit more deeply than just some of the sources that I have. It seems to be a difficult rendition, but the couple of scholars that I looked at, I'm not a scholar of this kind of stuff. I can read and understand some of it, but I'm not the scholar. I looked to scholars. And it seems like several of those scholars all agreed that the word means that Baal cannot contend even with Gideon. It's absolutely right. It is kind of the way the text translates it here, and it's absolutely right. So what do we do with all this? How do we pull all this together? Well, we can absolutely say that Gideon did okay. He did well in his first encounter with God or for God, even though he was reluctant and fearful at times. His rise before God and his people, yes, it is calculated, again, which is fine, but it wasn't overly courageous, which is not fine. He seeks out and he finds that God is very patient in his reluctance. That's the good thing that we need to know about us. That even though I can be hesitant at times, sometimes even fearful, God does not give up on us. If he has a plan, if I'm even willing to step out a little bit on faith, he'll use that. He'll take me and put me into places where he can display his power. But this will be his undoing at the end of his life, when he finds that his continual resistance to act courageously, without this continual reassurance that he always has to seem to have, just kind of leaves him open to a real serious lack of discernment and then scorn from his own people. And again, we'll pick up on this a little bit more next week, the weeks ahead, as we go a little bit deeper. I'm going to invite the praise team to come back up and invite you to stand together, and let's close in prayer.